When authoritarian governments or the military seize power, the first folks on the firing lines, often literally, are union leaders and union members. Because unions are about democracy, the best unions are, and standing up to economic and political power. Since the coup in Myanmar on February 1st, the trade union movement there is taking a leading role in protest and strike actions against the military and is calling for international solidarity action. And there is a global solidarity day coming up on Thursday, February 11th. So to give everyone an update and what we can all do to support our sisters and brothers in Myanmar, it's good to have back on the show Brian Finnegan, the Global Worker Rights Coordinator at the International Department of the AFL-CIO. And so, Brian, since the military coup on February 1st, as you well know, the trade union movement in Myanmar has been leading the protests against the coup. And before we dig a little bit into that and also the call for a day of solidarity with the trade union movement in the country, I want to make a broader point, which is this quite reminds me of the time that I went to El Salvador some years ago as part of a labor rights delegation. And at the time, as you well know, El Salvador was being ruled by a military junta under the support of the United States. The United States armed the junta, supported it. And the folks that were being attacked were, in fact, a lot of trade union folks, workers and trade union organizations, the good democratic ones. And so let's make a general point that this is not the first time, right, that in the world, in your experience as a global labor rights leader, it's not the first time that when a military coup happens or an authoritarian government takes over, that some of the first people they target are union leaders.
Well, clearly, I mean, a lot of my experience, as you talk about El Salvador, but I've lived and worked in South America, in the Southern Cone, Brazil, Uruguay, and Chile. And clearly in those places, they all had similar things a little bit before Central America. But this situation is different from Central America in one really important way. The military has been running the country for most of the last 70 years. And the last 10 years have been a healthy departure, a movement toward democracy. But the military never let go of the levers of not just political power, but also of a lot of economic power. And they have a business empire, and this is a big difference. I don't think in El Salvador you could point to that sort of real serious resources and connections with companies, US and other countries. So I think that's a big difference. And that's one of the things that there's consensus about, focusing on the economic assets and connections of these military run companies.
I want to make one point, though. The reason that unions are targeted, and totally understand the distinction you're making, but generally speaking, it's a fair point to make that unions are targeted when you have authoritarian regimes, and maybe not just when you have a military coup, but authoritarian regimes generally, because they are a threat to that kind of control, because in the best of circumstances, these unions represent democracy and democratic power by workers.
They're on the front lines. The unions are on the front lines of trying to build a democracy in the country. And it's in workplaces and it's in collective bargaining, but it's also in, out in the streets and day to day, and just the idea that no, the people have a voice, it's collective, and we vote on things. And again, that's the connection between unions fighting for workplace democracy and political democracy is clear. And in many places we see this, and we're seeing it in the last 10 days in Myanmar.
So give my audience basically a little schematic of what the labor movement looks like in Myanmar. Who do they represent? How many workers roughly? Again, I know it's a general picture, but so people get kind of a feel for how important the union movement is.
Well, you have to recall that for quite a few years, the country was isolated from trade and investment, Western investment anyway. And then when a lot of countries, starting after 2010, decided to figure out a way to go back there was a flooding in of investment from a lot of companies in garment and other sectors like that. But the country has huge assets in natural resources and energy and mining. But I'd say that the manufacturing unions have been in the last 10 years growing and organizing and having collective bargaining agreements. And last year that the ILO conference occurred, one of the cases I worked on was the freedom of association rights in Myanmar and collective bargaining. And it's very difficult. It was very difficult way before last week. But these are people who have been organizing a lot. The previous generation were mostly leaders in exile and with close relationships at AFL-CIO with some of those. And their organization now, there's a couple of major national ones, one called the CTUM is our major partner there. And the other thing that's interesting is they have really changed insofar as what was mostly older men leading. There's a lot of younger women in these garment worker unions that are who's part of the leadership, and actually hope to have you speak in the next several days with one of those women. So it's it's incredibly young, and there's a lot of U.S. brands and European brands that produce there. So this is a country of 57 million or something like that, and it's not a small country.
Yes, I remember actually to your point, sometimes if you looked at your garments, they were sourced in Myanmar. This was during the time of the military dictatorship. And I remember that very clearly. That was one of the countries that it was not a good feeling among other places in the world where slave labor is being used to see that embedded in a piece of garment. So what is happening on the ground right now, as far as you can tell, in terms of what's happening with labor unions? Are leaders being arrested? Are union headquarters being shut down? Give us a flavor for what's really at play, to the extent you know that.
What we're seeing and what we're hearing from partners on the ground is definitely a lot of surveillance and security forces going by the offices of unions, and some union leaders and some of the major federations, with good reason, going into hiding because they think that they will be placed on lists of people to be apprehended and arrested. But we don't have lists thus far of union leaders being detained. Lists are obviously from the NLD party and from some journalists and some other civil society leadership. But what we're seeing on the positive side is, in spite of the announcement of martial law and calling for a curfew and barring gatherings of more than 5 people, what we're seeing is hundreds of thousands of people in all the cities of the country going ahead and protesting and marching. You're seeing a lot of young people. You're seeing definitely the unions, and they're in large numbers. And there have been quite a few sort of what they're calling stay at home or a civil disobedience movement, they're calling it, but it's sort of a de facto general strike, starting with a lot of public sector and healthcare workers who've just stayed out of work to protest the coup. And that's sort of spreading and popping up in a sort of unpredictable way, but in large numbers. So the marches are going on, and at least since Saturday the 6th, it's been sustained. And again, in spite of the military's declarations, it's going on, and we expect it to continue going on. Unfortunately, you're also seeing some pro-military counter protests that we're concerned that could lead to they would foment violence. It's been a peaceful movement. You've seen a lot of people in the movement protesting who are using the Hunger Games, the 3 fingers signal of solidarity that's been in that region of the world used. So we're just seeing strong resistance. We're trying to support that, and that's why this Thursday, where the Myanmar embassy is, we will have a demonstration there with some Washington, D.C. based folks, and that's going to happen all over the world in different cities.
And before we get to some of the details about the protest, which I really want to have my audience participate in as much as possible, I'm going to really focus on some more of that in a second. I want to perhaps underscore a point that may be obvious, that this kind of protest, this kind of uprising among the people, I wonder whether that's because the notion of democracy has really taken hold in the past, say, decade, since more of the, if you will, representative government was elected, especially under the leadership of the National League for Democracy, and that you might not have seen that, say, 20 or 25 years ago. And it is a result partly of the activism of union organizations and union leaders, because people now feel like it's part of the culture there, it's part of their mission, it's part of their duty to make sure that democracy remains a viable reality there.
I think that's for the most part right on. The other thing, though, that you have to keep in mind is this is a country that has stood up before to try and take back democracy, or get democracy, and seen the military use force in some pretty shocking ways. So there's a younger generation that I think that they're aware of it, they've heard about it, but they're not standing down, they're standing up. But there's a lot of concern about this government, this military has shown a willingness to use violence against its people. So we've seen the violence already as far as using water cannons and rubber bullets, and there were some rumors of the military firing guns into the air, as in, we're getting more and more close to using the kind of thing they've seen before. But they are standing up. I think people, especially younger people, are engaged in this. As I said, the unions, the leadership, even is a lot more younger people. And the good side of the world being connected and the social media, people are doing things like in resistance, and they've seen some protests in places like Thailand and elsewhere in defense of democracy. So that's we're just trying to keep people's eyes on it and support the people of Myanmar and get the military out of where they don't belong.
And okay, so to wrap up, let's in fact talk about the concrete things that people can do on Thursday, which is the Global Day of Protest, as I understand. What can the audience do? What should they do? Where should they go? Obviously, mostly virtually. Is it a social media campaign, holding up three fingers? What would you suggest and recommend?
We will be physically actually going, some people in Washington, D.C., in front of the embassy, which is a pretty standard thing to do here in the capital in Washington. You have embassies. So we'll be going to the Myanmar embassy. Other places people in the United States could go to, in New York, there is their mission to the UN. Among the things being called for is for them to their seat to be vacated at the UN. And the other possibility is, I believe it's in Los Angeles, there's a consulate. So any of those three locations, people who are willing to, obviously we're doing this with, COVID-19 protocols, social distancing, and masks for anybody who can participate. We will be doing a lot of social media. We'll be doing things on Twitter and Facebook. And the ITUC, who's called for this Global Day of Action, the International Trade Union Confederation, will be tracking this, and we'll be sending images and sounds and messages from what we do. And I'm sure we'll have a gathering of all the different places this is going to happen this Thursday.
So is there a central website people can go to find out all about these activities and how to best plug in?
I think so far it's the ITUC, and I forwarded you a couple of graphics from that, and I know they'll be gathering them. I don't have anything more central. I worked through the local labor council here to get it on the calendar of the labor council. So that, again, we're just in this location doing this here. ITUC would be doing this, and also something called the Council of Global Unions. So the unions from different sectors of the economy, they will be tracking this and encouraging participation.
So people should just look up the International Trade Union Confederation, go to their website, ituc.org, I believe it is, and just basically follow whatever hints and links they have to try to support this effort to protect the unions in Myanmar. And Brian, thanks a lot, as usual, for bringing your expertise and also the alert about this important solidarity action. We'll have you back on the show to just update us as soon as we can.
Thank you for making time for this important stuff. And I will send you one other link for this Council of Global Unions, another place they'll be encouraging this and tracking it.